Hi, everyone. Thanks for checking out the Safe Travels podcast. My name is Joey. Today, we're at Glacier National Park in Montana, and we have the honor of sitting down with Diane Sine. Diane is a local legend here. She has been recreating and working in Glacier for 45 summers. She is the Many Glacier lead interpreter, and in this conversation, we talked all about geology, park history, and general park information if you're planning a trip to Glacier National Park. Diane, it's an honor to have you on. You are, I know you're not going to like that I say this, but a local legend who has been here for 45 summers. And you started here a long time ago with your family growing up in Seattle and then visiting here on vacation. What was that experience like? What made you fall in love with Glacier National Park?
Well, I was really fortunate in growing up in a family that hiked and camped a lot. And so we took advantage of every time my dad had vacation, we would load the family into the station wagon and go visit another national park. So I was a national park nerd from the very beginning. I actually just recently came across a notebook that I had started as an elementary child that's called National Parks I Have Visited. And I had carefully written that out on the cover, and I collected a brochure in every national park we visited. So I just, because of my family background, I loved national parks. So we came to Glacier a couple times in my childhood, and I think I was particularly struck by this place. I loved going to ranger talks. I was just a national park nerd. I would make sure that the family had finished dinner in time to go to the campground talk with the ranger and go on the guided hikes. And in this particular park, I can remember we were camping. We weren't able to stay in hotels, but we were camping and we went and visited the Many Glacier Hotel. And I learned that at that point, that particular hotel was fully staffed by college kids recruited from all over the United States, particularly because they were involved in music and theater. And I was a cellist. I'm a cellist today. And so I decided as a child that I wanted to work at the Many Glacier Hotel, do a regular hotel job, but be part of this music program that went on every evening and in our off hours. So I figured out how to get a job. And when I was 18 years old, the day after I graduated from high school in Seattle, I got on the train, came out here, and I've been here ever since, really.
I love that story. And in a previous podcast you did, one thing that you said that I really loved was exactly what you kind of just said, is that you're a national parks nerd. And so being here, it's hard for it to feel like work because you're so in love with this landscape and everything that you do. When you kind of reflect back and look at your notebook, does it feel like life's full circle, growing up admiring rangers, going to ranger talks? Now you're the one administering those ranger talks and those tours?
Oh, completely. I mean, it's kind of a dream fulfilled. And in my case, I had another career. I figured out early on that it was particularly hard to get a permanent job and support yourself as a park ranger. But I went to school and became an elementary teacher. And so I had a career as an elementary teacher, doing this as my hobby job in the summer. And so it's always been a passion more than something that I had to do. And I was fortunate I was able to retire from elementary teaching, and opportunities opened up, and I was able to do this for even more of the year. So it is absolutely a choice and a passion for me. I'm pretty fortunate.
One amazing story, going back to you being an elementary school teacher, is you had to ask your principal for some time off because a very important person was coming to Glacier National Park and you wanted to be a part of it, and you were asked to be a part of it. Can you retell and relive that story?
Sure. I think you're referring to 1997. Again, I was teaching sixth grade at the time. And Al Gore was vice president of the United States. And about the last week in August, suddenly there was a lot of talking around the park, and Al Gore was going to come out right after Labor Day and hike up to Grinnell Glacier with a whole media team. Actually, he was going to give a speech and then hike up to the glacier to draw attention to climate change by getting national attention to the fact that Grinnell Glacier, along with all the other glaciers in this park, was showing significant recession over the years and becoming smaller all the time. And so that was one of Al Gore's passions. Of course, he had a lot of responsibilities as vice president, but may recall he really got the public more tuned into the fact that things were changing as far as climate. So yes, I had the opportunity to go along. I actually took the pre-positioned media up to the glacier, which was pretty hilarious because some of them were local and knew about hiking, and some of them got straight off Air Force Two coming from Washington, D.C., and were out of their element. And as opposed to technology right now, there was video camera this size going along being carried on that trip. But it was a fun opportunity to be part of that chance to get people more and more aware of what was happening, that what we can see on the ground here in Glacier National Park having to do with our namesake glaciers.
Yeah, that's such an amazing story. Let's dive into the namesake here and this amazing park. First, let's start off with what's behind us. We have this amazing view here right behind the amphitheater that nightly ranger talks are given at. So what are we looking at behind us?
So this is Lake McDonald. We're on the west side of the park, and this is our classic glaciated landscape. It's a classic U-shaped valley, a broad U-shape that was carved out by Ice Age glaciers. And then we have the incredible peaks on the edges that were what was left remaining when the Ice Age glacier, the Pleistocene glacier, carved out this valley. And so we have glaciation in our face throughout Glacier National Park. But ironically, it's not this glaciated landscape that gave the park its name. That's been misrepresented sometimes, and I think it was a convenient idea. But when we've looked back historically at the people who wanted to get the park established in the beginning of the 1900s, they really were excited about that this was a place that people could get to honest to goodness glaciers without going to Alaska, without going to Patagonia. People could come out west on the Great Northern Railway. They would get from the railroad up here to the foot of Lake McDonald and take a boat up the lake. There was no road along the lake shore at that time. And then they would hike up to places like Sperry Glacier. And so the park really was named for the fact that there were really these relatively small glaciers, especially compared to the Ice Age glaciers. And it does cause some confusion on the part of visitors. People come from all over the world to a place called Glacier National Park. And a lot of times the name of the park sets an expectation, and they're thinking of photographs they've seen of Alaska or Patagonia. And so we get all sorts of visitors who show up here in the park, and they want to drive to a glacier. They want to hike to a glacier. They want to take a snow coach tour across a glacier. And the reality is there were massive glaciers right here, but we're about 12,000 years too late for the snow coach tour. The really big glaciers that carved this landscape were the ones from the Pleistocene. But it's amazing. We do still have the last remnants of those glaciers that were the namesake, that got the attention, that caused the park to have the name Glacier National Park. But those glaciers are becoming smaller all the time, and we may not have them forever.
We were talking off camera, the difficulty of wrapping our head around geologic time. The geologic scale is so massive, it's hard for us to comprehend. But one of the unique things about Glacier National Park is, you just alluded to it, you can see geological processes taking place in real time with the Grinnell Glacier and other glaciers in the park actively melting, and we see them shrinking and getting smaller. What is that like, seeing an active geologic process taking place? And from your perspective, is it kind of hard to see these glaciers that you've seen for 45 years start to kind of dissipate and disappear?
There is emotion, almost a level of grief in a way. also a degree of excitement that I have actually been able to see some of these changes. I first started hiking to Grinnell Glacier in 1980, and that's 45 years. So it has changed dramatically. I have clear memories of walking along massive walls of ice along the edge of the glacier in places where there's no ice at all right now. When I first started leading ranger guided hikes to Grinnell Glacier, we were able to take visitors and walk out onto the glacier surface and look down into crevasses that were 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 feet deep. The places where we used to be able to leave the bedrock and walk out onto the ice, it's now bedrock to lake because there's no ice at all in that area. I have seen the edge of that glacier recede, move back well over a quarter of a mile, maybe even closer to half a mile. And so, I mean, it's not even safe for visitors to walk out over that ice anymore. That was something we would definitely not encourage people to do because it's not the same kind of level surface. There are a lot of hidden dangers as well, but it's been pretty profound to be able to see those kinds of changes. That is not just some hypothetical idea. I have seen those changes.
And because of those changes, I think folks, might interpret the ice just going away, and that's the effect of it. But there's a lot of downstream effects of what it can mean to lose glaciers in this atmosphere. What are some of those downstream effects that could affect wildlife and water levels, etc.?
Absolutely. So that's one of the cool things about a place like Glacier National Park is that it provides almost a laboratory to study these things. So we don't have all the answers, but the great thing is that we have this landscape that's fairly pristine, and we have an opportunity to look for answers and monitor what is going on. So we know that there are things like stoneflies that live in the cold meltwater from glaciers that are dependent on those cold temperatures. Then there are fish that are dependent on the aquatic insects, that all of those things can be affected if we lose the glaciers, if we lose the source of year-round cold water up there. All sorts of research that goes on in the park, just trying to understand what is going on as far as inventory and monitoring. Other things not directly having to do with the ice itself, but having to do with changes in overall weather patterns, climate conditions, tree line that is rising on some of our peaks, areas that animals that are dependent on the protection of snow cover, wolverine, denning, ptarmigan, a bird that lives up in the subalpine elevations that seems to be dependent on snow patches. Pikas, pike one of my favorite animals. They go cheep, a little ball of fur. But those pikas that live in the high elevations are really dependent on having shelter in places where they aren't exposed to warmer temperatures. So exciting that Glacier does provide an opportunity to study and learn about those things. But again, kind of sobering when we see some of these things changing. Of course, there's always been change, but this change seems to be happening at such a rapid pace.
I love the perspective that these pristine places are laboratories for incredibly talented people to come here and study and be able to release information to the public. I think I was reading with Glacier is like, this is one of these areas that gives pristine wilderness to bears. And so if we're able to study bears in this environment, we're able to take those learnings and put them in areas that might be more affected by anthropogenic effects and how it could affect, bears in those areas too.
Yeah, we're really fortunate. We have this combination in Glacier of pristine not technically designated wilderness. That's something that's been proposed for many decades, but a de facto wilderness. And at the same time, we have Going to the Sun Road running through the middle of it, giving people incredible access to those areas. But one of the great things is that that road is just a narrow corridor of development, and the areas beyond that are pristine. It's one of those things with the exciting mission of a national park where there's always that tension, because on the one hand, a national park like Glacier is here to preserve and protect both the natural and the cultural resources. But at the same time, we're here for the enjoyment of people. And so it is that tension which gives a lot of the meaning to a national park.
Let's dive more into the geology of this place. I know there's 4 core principles that have made up this beautiful landscape at Glacier National Park. What are those principles?
Well, and I even cut it down to 3 because I'm an elementary teacher, and so things need to be as simple as possible. So I'm no geologist, and you get the 5th grade version, basically. But you can understand the geology in Glacier pretty easily if you just think of answering 3 basic questions. The first one being, where did all this rock come from in the first place? And our rock in Glacier is primarily sedimentary rock, and it's old rock. It's Precambrian rock. And so it's rock that was deposited as layers of sediment in a warm, shallow sea. So we have different colors in the rock, even looking around us. You'll notice the red and the green rocks always are really noticeable to people. And they simply reflect different conditions, different amounts of oxygen that were available as these layers of mud accumulated in the shallow sea. There were layers of really just, it's easiest to think of it as accumulated mud and then limestones that also formed. And so we have these layers of sedimentary rock. Because it's sedimentary rock, it is not a great place for technical mountain climbing. You may have noticed some of the parks you go to, technical mountain climbing is a big deal with the climbing culture. People do climb to the tops of all of these mountains, but it tends to be more of a non-technical scramble. And people need to be really careful because our sedimentary rock is crumbling and breaking away all of the time. So we have these layers of sedimentary rock. The second question would be, how do we get mountains? Because layers of sediment seem like it would be flat. So the second step in the geology has to do with uplifting and moving of those layers of rock. Basically a time when North America didn't look anything like it does right now. We were closer to an ocean that was off to what's the west right now. That plate was colliding with this continental plate. It caused all sorts of disruption. Pressure from the west caused those layers to be pushed from the west, eventually get folded and warped and break along a fault line. And it caused many, many layers to ride over the corresponding layers, creating the first mountains here. And that's why on the eastern side of the park, you can really see a distinctive edge to the Rocky Mountains here. And then the third step, because those mountains probably wouldn't have gotten us designated as a national park. They wouldn't have been that dramatic. So the third step is answering the question, how did we get the incredible degree of drama in this landscape? And that's where the Ice Age glaciers come in. And again, glaciers confuse people. But it's really simple, whether we're talking about an Ice Age glacier or one of our remaining small alpine glaciers today. To get a glacier, you simply have to have a place where more snow falls every winter than can completely melt during the summers. So over the years, that snow builds up, it accumulates, it becomes quite dense. And once you have a certain amount of dense accumulated ice, there's so much weight and pressure on the bottom layers that they actually have plasticity and start to flow with the mass of the ice and with gravity. So the Ice Age glaciers had their their source up in the mountains, what's the Continental Divide here today. And it was the movement of those Ice Age glaciers that slowly carved out this dramatic scenery that we have today.
It's amazing. The nickname of this place, because of the dramatic scenery, is the crown of the continent. Where did that come from? And is it purely because of how beautiful and majestic this area is?
The crown of the continent is actually a name that was first brought by a man named George Bird Grinnell, who is an important part of the history of this park. He's considered by many to be sort of the father of Glacier National Park. George Bird Grinnell was this well-to-do Easterner who was fascinated with the West, was fascinated with Native people, came out west on multiple trips. He ended up being the editor of what was sort of the gentleman's outdoor journal of the day, a journal that was called Forest and Stream magazine. And so George Bird Grinnell first came out into this area in 1885 on a hunting trip, interestingly enough. But because he was editor of this journal, he documented his trip. We have a great record. He came back multiple times over the years, and he's the one who first started to sort of spread the word about the specialness of this landscape. He published magazine articles, and in one of those, he coined that crown of the continent. And I think he was getting at the fact that it is the apex of three water drainage systems. So where we are sitting here at Lake McDonald right now, this water is going to eventually go to the Pacific. In the northeast part of the park, we have water that flows toward Hudson Bay. And then in the southeast part of the park, we have water that flows down into the Missouri and the Mississippi and out that way. So it is the apex of the continent in that way with those water drainages. And then I have to believe that he partially used crown of the continent just because of the majesty of this landscape.
That's fascinating. And I was going to ask you context around the Continental Divide and what that means. I think you see tons of signage coming up to Glacier National Park stating that you're in the Continental Divide. And so to hear the water drainage and the water passage kind of spread out across, really, as you mentioned, the apex, this being the heart of that, is fascinating to recognize when you're here.
Frequently, people want to have their picture taken with the Continental Divide sign at Logan Pass without really understanding what the Continental Divide is. But it is simply that imaginary line that connects the high points that therefore define the water drainage system.
I want to talk a bit more about the people in a moment, but while you mention Logan's Pass, what about some other areas of the park that are iconic area? I know Heaven's Peak, which the going to the Sun Road to get up to there right now, the time that I'm here, isn't currently open, but there's tons of bikers going up that way. That's like the quintessential iconic photos of Heaven's Peak. But what are those areas in this park that people really admire here?
Well, certainly going to the Sun Road is a wonderful resource. It's a historic road. It's the first road that was really built in a national park to be an iconic driving experience as opposed to just getting people from point A to point B. And so a lot of the places that people access the most just because of the ease of accessibility are along the road. And it does give you an opportunity to see the really diverse landscapes that we have in the park. Here on the west side of the Continental Divide, we have this older cedar hemlock forest. Then the road takes people up to higher elevations in the subalpine around Logan Pass, and then drops down to the east side of the park, down in the St. Mary area, where it is a drier, windier environment with a whole different complex of plant communities. Of course, this time of year that we're visiting, the upper elevations of going to the Sun Road, the upper elevations of the park aren't accessible at all. It is still hardcore winter at those elevations right now. But the nice thing about Glacier is it's a large enough park. It has access in multiple areas that people can really have a variety of experiences year round, as long as they have taken the time to research and understand and have realistic expectations, because you don't have the experience of hiking or driving to the highest elevations in the park this time of year, but there are a whole different set of unique experiences people can have.
Yeah, it's beautiful and peaceful here right now, and looking at the snow-capped mountains behind us is really majestic.
Yeah. When the crowds are here in the middle of summer, they may get up to higher elevations, but there won't be as much snow on those mountains, and it won't be quite as quiet here at Apgar.
Why do visitors find Heaven's Peak to be so iconic, and why is that the quintessential photo of this park?
Well, there is no single quintessential photo. There are many of them, to tell you the truth. And certainly on the east side, Wild Goose Island, and I honestly try to avoid any idea that there is one best photo or one best experience. I feel like so often people get caught up in trying to find a certain photograph or a certain experience, and in a way they miss all the other experiences they could have. I think it's way better for people to collect information, have ideas of various places they might want to go in the park, but and of course there are certain reservations that you need to get and some planning. But I really discourage people from thinking that there's one photograph or one experience, because like I said, I've spent 45 years in this park and I have never had one best experience or photograph.
I love that perspective. So thank you for sharing that. And I agree. I walked up going to the Sun Road yesterday, foolishly thinking I can make it all the way to Heaven's Peak. In a way, I think I'm grateful that I couldn't, because I went off to Johns Lake and some other beautiful areas of the park. And it was an amazing experience. It was really special.
Exactly. I think that allowing yourself to visit the park on the park's terms rather than our own terms allows us to have a better experience that isn't just about us, and to find those experiences that we stumble upon, whether it's a bird that's diving into the water in the creek that we happen to see, or just an opportunity to watch a chipmunk. It doesn't have to be iconic wildlife, but to stumble upon things, enjoy the light coming down through the trees, and just enjoy the unexpected has incredible value.
Touching on that point too, going on the trailheads here, the first thing that you're reminded of, right, when you get onto the trailhead is that you're in grizzly country, and it gives you precautions. And I think for some folks that visit here and are looking for those experiences, it might be nerve-wracking. But going back to the point you just made, I think when you see a sign like that, from my perspective, it just kind of humbles you and reminds you of, yeah, you're on the park's terms here. And when you're stepping foot in a place like this, you're a part of the ecosystem, and to understand what you're around, what's around you, how to protect them, how to mitigate risks, I think is really special about this park. Is it does feel like you're on the park's terms.
And knowing that you're in the habitat of such varied, incredible wildlife. Again, bears get a lot of press around here, and we'll get so many people who, again, have this checklist that, I want to see a bear, I want to see a mountain goat, I want to see a moose, I want to see a bighorn sheep. And it's not a zoo. It's a national park. I mean, even zoos now seem to try to cultivate an experience that's more like being out in nature, because you want animals to be in their natural habitat with their natural behaviors. And that means you can't completely predict where you're going to see them. And so there are opportunities to see amazing wildlife here. But for me, a lot of the value is to just know that I'm hiking a trail that is the habitat of grizzly bears and wolves and mountain lions and wolverines. And I'm going to see a Columbian ground squirrel, most likely as my guaranteed animal, but I know I'm in the habitat of those animals. And even if the big one, even if I don't see some of those big charismatic megafauna, they might see me, and that adds to the experience.
Absolutely. How about vegetation in the park, the lodgepole pine and other iconic trees in the area? What can visitors expect to see when they're hiking and visiting the park?
Incredible variation in different parts of the park. These big old growth forests here in the Lake McDonald area, compared to younger forests on the east side of the park, where Again, we have more of the lodgepole pine. Of course, lodgepole is a tree that doesn't live forever. Well, nothing lives forever, but there's a fire regime that's part of what we have with lodgepole pine, and fire being part of that natural landscape. Then upper elevations without as many big trees, smaller vegetation. It's a tough place to live up there at Logan Pass, and so the vegetation doesn't grow as tall. It's also a place where we have to be incredibly cognizant of the short growing season and the impact that we can have on the subalpine or alpine environments, where it's just vital to stay on the trail and not spread out and create new trails and places.
Touching back on the human story of Glacier National Park, George Berg Grinnell, the Grinnell Glacier, named after him. He visited it and I believe had a journal witnessing what he saw over his years visiting the glacier. How about the native tribes that have called this place home? What are some of those traditional tribes that have been here since time immemorial?
Yeah, and it's a good point, because just like we were talking about, it's hard to get our minds around a geologic timescale. It's hard to realize that the history of European Americans on this landscape is just a tiny fraction of the time period that people have been on this landscape. And so we have archaeological evidence dating way back longer than 10,000 years on as far as people being here. And certainly all of our tribal partners have stories of their people being on this landscape, basically since the beginning of time, according to their stories. And so it's important to realize that people valuing this place is nothing new. It's not something that the National Park Service invented. People have valued this place for thousands and thousands of years. Here at Lake McDonald, the west side of the park, Salish, Kootenai, Pend d'Oreille people are some of the folks that are most closely associated with this landscape. On the east side of the park, the Blackfeet folks are the people that have been most closely associated. And sometimes people have a tendency to think that this was the land of the Blackfeet or the Salish, Kootenai, Pend d'Oreille, but it still is. Those people are still here and still very connected to the landscape. And the Park Service works with all of those tribes to work cooperatively in communicating the importance of this area from their cultural perspectives that, again, have a much longer history than the National Park Service does here.
That's amazing. What are some of the projects that the Park Service has worked on with the native tribes that have existed here?
Well, one of the things that my division, the Division of Interpretation, does is we have the longest established Indigenous speaker series in the park, because the Park Service recognized years ago that, again, the native perspective on this land, not only the history, but the current perspective, is a vital part of the story here. And it makes no sense for somebody who grew up in Seattle to be sharing that story. So we have members of all of those tribes who come and tell those stories and share their perspective every night of the week in the summer in different parts of the park. We have our local tribal partners sharing those stories.
Right up the road here, as we were driving to this beautiful spot, we noticed on the dock there was a park ranger giving a program to a bunch of kids sitting on the dock. And you had mentioned that that's a vital part of Glacier National Park, is the robust education programs that are here. How important, just in general, is education for folks before visiting here and understanding what they're stepping into, and then when they're here, diving into those types of programs and getting to learn how special this place is?
Yeah, we and it's where my life, everything intersects, because, of course, like I said, I was an elementary teacher. I was able to take advantage of those opportunities, like the kids you saw today. I would bring my classes up here on field trips. And sometimes people think that if you live close to a national park, you're intimately associated with it, but that's not necessarily the case. Even some of the children who live close by don't get an opportunity to come here except for those school field trips. And the same thing with the general public that comes, we try to gear a lot of things toward children. We have junior ranger programs where kids can do activities because ultimately, I think one of the profound things about a national park is people come here and think there's something almost sacred and protected about this place. There is, but the protection is only because this place had value to people who went to an awful lot of work to have the national park established. And that protection will only continue as long as it continues to have value to people. And so that's why we want people of all ages to have those experiences where they will feel that personal connection to this place and hopefully want to protect it for future generations.
I love that. One thing that I always admire about park rangers and being in these landscapes is rangers come from all walks of life. You're an elementary school teacher from Seattle, and I've talked to many other rangers that come from various different walks of life. But one thing I don't want to gloss over with your story is one of the reasons you fell in love with becoming a park ranger is because when you came here, you saw your first female park ranger, and you aspired to be that because you saw that female ranger here and had a connection with her. What does that mean to you to carry that legacy forward now and see the kind of the diversity amongst the workforce here in the Park Service?
Exactly, and I think it's part of why it's so important to have a wide representation of people in these kinds of positions, because it's when you realize that something is possible and it's not just a cool thing that somebody else does, but it's a cool thing that I could do, that you could do, that anybody could do. So I think that was significant for me, and I hope in some way I can inspire younger people to continue to be passionate about and connected to these places.
You're certainly an inspiration to me. I love reading about your story, and obviously I love getting the chance to talk with you. We talked about how rugged this landscape is. It's majestic, it's rugged, it's not a rock climber's dream paradise to climb. So what are the safety precautions that people need to know when they come here regarding wildlife or regarding the landscape?
A lot of it is just realizing that this is a wild area. It is not a theme park. And so just realizing, of course, you talked about bears, and people sometimes get overly concerned about bears, but we understand it's something that's outside of the realm of most people's experiences. So just regular things that we recommend have to do with there's safety or increased safety in hiking the trails with other people, not wandering out alone, making noise when you're on a trail, which again is counterintuitive to a lot of people that want to come and have a quiet experience in nature. But when you can't see what's ahead of you on the trail, just holler now or something that carries ahead, so that if there is a bear or another animal, you're not going to come around a corner and startle it. A startled bear is perhaps going to act unpredictably, and so we don't want to startle wildlife. Other safety things, just realizing that this is cold water. Even in August, this is cold water. We have streams and rivers that are very swiftly moving. It can be mossy and slick on the edges, so staying away from getting too close to what can be an unfortunate accident if people slip into running water. Just having that respect for, again, cliff faces and things. Just not thinking that we're invincible in nature.
Yes. Mother Nature is always in control, as I've learned so many times. But there's over 700 miles of hiking trails here. How important is understanding your own fitness levels and your capabilities when you're out on the trails here?
Yeah, we have something for everyone. We have short nature trails. And I think another thing that I like to remind people is you don't have to go tens of miles to have an amazing experience. Sometimes it can be a very short trail. And so, yes, people realizing that if they're not used to hiking 12, 15 miles with elevation, this is probably not the place to have that first experience, but they can still have an amazing opportunity on some of those shorter hikes as well.
What about when the park is open and the snow starts to melt and the roads are cleared and all services are available? What are some of the backcountry experiences that folks have here?
Well, one thing to keep in mind, again, as you mentioned with the snow melting, Our season where our high alpine trails are free of snow is very short, and people are often very surprised to get here in June and realize that they can't drive the entirety of Going to the Sun Road yet. And so expectations just to realize that our higher elevation trails are not free of snow until late July, August, and they may still have snow patches. And that's another safety thing to realize that crossing high angle snow can be incredibly dangerous and not always something you should be doing if you don't have a lot of experience and the technical equipment to do that. But again, just being aware, researching our park website is an incredible resource. And so checking that, we also have the National Park Service app, which we're getting more and more information that you can download ahead of the time, because one of the things to be aware of is that we don't have cell service in much of Glacier National Park. So becoming familiar with that information ahead of time, downloading the app ahead of time. And then the visitor centers are a great resource to arrive in the park and check at a visitor center for current trail conditions. And again, that's why I discourage people from thinking that they have to hike a particular trail, because that might not be available when you get here, but that doesn't mean you're not going to have an incredible experience here.
That's what I was going to go to next is, what are some of, in your opinion, the hidden gems that might get passed over because people come with one personal goal that they want to see X? What are some of the gems that you've fallen in love with over the years of being here?
A lot of times it's just the little things. It's stumbling upon wildlife that you didn't expect to see. Some quiet time sitting by a rushing stream or a quiet alpine lake. Again, being open to your own experiences and not feeling like you have to have some big glamorous experience that you read about that somebody else had.
The last question I want to ask about trip planning is, as we inch closer to summer, and every summer, time reservations and vehicle entry. What can you share about that? And what is the purpose of time reservations getting into the park?
So the vehicle reservation system is something that we are still developing because we have needed to adapt things for increases in visitation. Again, I've been here for a while, and annual visitation to Glacier has doubled in the years that I've worked here. So we had about 1.5 million visitors a year when I started working, and we now get over 3 million visitors a year. But again, part of our mission is to be protecting these natural resources. So it's not like we can just keep building new roads and expanding parking lots. You don't want to pave paradise to put up a parking lot. And so we have to protect both the natural resources and protect the visitor experience. Because again, people don't come here to have a big city congested experience. So over the last few years, we have been piloting different variations of a vehicle reservation system. And so it has varied year to year because we have been collecting information, getting public input, getting input from our park neighbors. But if you're going to come to Glacier during the height of the season, you need to be aware that certain parts of the park will require a reservation for your vehicle to access the park. And it has varied again year to year. It's best to look at the park website. That's where we always have the most up-to-date information. But it's been pretty successful in giving people the experience they're looking for without having to deal with the congested traffic that they can't even move in. Now, still, if you're here during the busy part of the season, you still have to have flexibility. You may not be able to park any place you want to. You need to come in early for some of that trailhead parking. So remaining flexible is good.
If I were to ask you, what your favorite memory is of Glacier National Park, I'm curious to know if you have a story that you often think about or an experience you often think about in terms of, your love for this place.
Again, with that whole idea of there not being one single best, for me, it's the unexpected, non-dramatic experiences that I have in the park. Hiking a trail with friends, coming around a corner and finding wildflowers in a meadow where I didn't expect them to be in bloom. Just the connection with the majesty of this landscape as opposed to any one little moment.
Do you think about your younger self and kind of how proud your younger self would have been to see where you're at today and all that you've accomplished in this place?
I've been fortunate, and I'm grateful for this place and for these experiences and the opportunities that I've had here.
Any final thoughts or something you want to share with listeners and viewers about this place, or encouragement on why they should come out here? And I feel like this view behind us is encouragement enough.
But it's all right here. Again, coming, experiencing it, but experiencing it on its terms rather than making it all about ourselves, I think is what's important.
What would you say to a younger listener, or a listener of any age, on just the importance and the spirit of conservation and protecting our lands, and why being in a place like this can reshape your perspective on the day-to-day life?
It seems like every year life gets more complicated, and so to just treasure these places, these opportunities, the peace, the tranquility, the connection with nature is something that I personally value more and more every year, and I hope other people can get that experience too.
Diane, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for checking out this edition of the Safe Travels podcast. I really hope you enjoyed it. And as one other park ranger told me, Diane Sine is a fixture here at Glacier National Park. So if you like this type of content, it'd mean a lot to me if you liked, commented, and subscribed. And until next time, safe travels.